Hello,
Hi.
Connie. Welcome, everyone. Super excited to be here today again with Dr. Connie. This is going to be a really special conversation. Today, we're diving back into the fascinating and transformative world of shadow work, particularly how it impacts our relationships with our significant others. And I'm really honored to be here today with Dr. Connie Zweig. She's a pioneering voice in this field and the author of Romancing the Shadow, The Inner Work of Age, Meeting the Shadow, and A Moth to the Flame. And her work has profoundly shaped the way that we understand the hidden aspects of ourselves and how they influence the way we love and connect and grow together. So, in this interview, we'll be exploring how our unconscious patterns and conflicts in relationships show up, and we will look at how to understand and mesh these hidden parts of ourselves to deepen our intimacy and improve our connection with our partners and transform even the most challenging relational dynamics. And shadow work awareness is really about taking responsibility for the parts of ourselves that we often project out onto others, um, learning how to navigate our triggers with curiosity instead of blame, and showing up in our relationships and in turn our life and for ourselves with more authenticity and empathy and compassion. So, whether you're just beginning your journey into shadow work or you've been exploring these ideas for a while now, I hope this conversation inspires you all to continue the work, continue the dance with your shadows. Um, and I hope it inspires you to approach your relationships and to approach yourself with that greater awareness and intention. So let's begin.
Thank you, Keila.
Thank you. So, in your book, Romancing the Shadow, you describe the shadow as our disowned self. Can you elaborate on how the shadow operates, specifically in relationships, and why it's so important to bring your awareness and attention there?
Yeah, I think there's so many names for the shadow. The disowned self is one. The personal unconscious, the rejected parts, um, internal family systems has another language for it. Um, and so I think these disowned, rejected, unacceptable parts of ourselves become familiar to us when they erupt into our conscious awareness and they sabotage our conscious intentions. We
Mm.
don't really see them or know about them until then because they're in a blind spot, right? They're unconscious. They're outside of our awareness. And so we think, well, why bother? Who needs to look at the shadow? Because it's hidden. Just let it be, right? But what happens often in relationships is it emerges sometimes in harmful ways. Could be self-destructive for us, and it could be hurtful to another person. So, if we want to build conscious relationships in which we're really honoring and welcoming all the parts of ourselves and all the parts of another person, a partner, a friend, a family member, and we're really open to exploring consciously who we are. One of my friends calls himself a multitude. So
Mm.
if we really are open to doing that, then we need some kind of practice like shadow work to be able to glimpse these hidden parts and learn how to work with them and heal the wounds when they erupt in hurtful ways.
Mhm. Yeah. And the shadow often reveals itself in how we connect with others or disconnects, experience that disconnection with others, like the triggers you feel and the conflicts that you experience in relationships, the ways you shut down or lash out. All of those are signals of the shadow showing up or wanting to emerge in some way, shape, or form. because it's asking for our attention. And when you see it as a call and answer the call, you open that door for deeper connection and understanding.
Yes, well said. So there are many ways we meet the shadow. And and I would add to your list a couple things. One of them is in moods. So when someone is moody, anxious, depressed, there's a shadow there. And also in our dreams,
Mm.
we might find ourselves doing things that are totally unacceptable to our egos, to our conscious personalities in our dreams.
Mm.
And that's a shadow coming with a message. So that's another way we could meet the shadow.
Mm.
And in humor, like, when people say something funny, but it's actually mean, right?
Mhm.
Like off-color jokes, it
Mm.
shows up like that. There are all kinds of ways that we meet the shadow.
Yeah, definitely.
So in relationships, which is our focus today, a lot of people, when they're dating, go looking for some ideal, right? An ideal man, an ideal woman, a partner who meets all of these kind of fantasy needs that we carry around. And a lot of those needs are unmet childhood needs from early in our lives. And so we imagine that that partner is going to be the parent we never had. She'll be comforting and nurturing, and he'll be safe and supportive and talkative. And they'll be really different in heterosexual couples. They'll be different from the opposite sex parent, right? And then other people are looking for the same. They're looking for that mommy they loved or that daddy who treated them special. And so they end up projecting what you mentioned before, which is unconsciously attributing to the other person some of the traits of a parent. And what happens when that projection pops or it breaks down? Oh my God, he's not who I thought he was. She's really angry. She's not nurturing. Or she needs so much space. She's not there for me. Or he's really mean when he's angry, right? And the projection pops. So often what happens is that's when people break up or divorce. That's the common response, is to run when you meet the shadow of the other person. From my point of view, this is the moment that you have the greatest opportunity to really see that person beyond the persona, beyond the presentation of dating, and to really explore the possibilities of a deeper connection, like you mentioned. How do we get a deeper bond that's beyond that sort of, mask of
Yeah.
dating?
The tension can either, well, depending on how you go about it, it's kind of like a string, and there's tension, and you can either snap it and cut it and the relationship can dissipate, or you can use it as an opportunity to stretch and grow and expand your capacity to love the other person.
Yeah, good metaphor. You can cut it, snap it, or you can stretch it.
Mhm.
So some people will have an affair, right? And what happens then? The energy is pulled out of the primary relationship, the psychic energy, the emotional energy, and that fantasy projection lands on somebody else. Oh, that person is going to really take care of me and meet my needs, right?
You talked about briefly our childhood experiences, specifically the relationships that we've had with our parental influences. Um, and it's so crazy to think about how much weight our psyches place on the relationships that we've had with our guardians. So I'd love to dive into that a little bit deeper with you. Because as children, we are like sponge absorbing all the dynamics and behaviors and emotional cues of the people around us, but especially of the parents around us if they were present. So what can you share in that aspect so that
Well,
or
even if they weren't present,
Mhm,
even if they were absent, that also shapes the shadow.
mhm,
So, I remember I had a client whose father died when she was very young, and that absent male figure shaped her entire life. So, present, absent, they're going to influence how the shadow forms. And so, part of the way it happens is, um, like you said, we're little sponges. And we're taking in all the messaging. It can be a gesture or a word or a touch, or it can be a really loud statement. It can be subtle or it can be really overt. But if the message is that you're good, and that's a good thing, and that's approval, and that's positive, then that trait or behavior goes into your conscious personality. Oh, they want me to be nice, so I'm going to be nice and then I'll be loved. We don't say that, but that's the internal system working like, okay, the operating system says be nice, don't be angry. So the anger goes into the shadow and the niceness goes into the ego or the conscious personality. And everything is kind of internalized like that. Let's say it's about sexuality and the message is, oh, that's bad, you'll go to hell, don't touch yourself. So all of those feelings go into the shadow, right? Now, they may erupt later, let's say in adolescence, with a lot of sexual acting out and seductiveness, right? Because that repressed material at some point is going to erupt. And it might not erupt for many, many years until later in life. When let's say, a woman or a man hasn't explored sexuality and suddenly decides to do that and break that rule, right? Or it could be about sadness. Don't cry. Little boy, good boys don't cry. That's for sissies, right? So boys learn that a whole range of emotion is bad
mhm.
and it will result in rejection and shame. And so all those emotions get buried in the shadow.
Yeah.
So there are some gender differences.
Mhm.
Um, so that's how the ego and the shadow get shaped in tandem. It happens with clergy a lot, the messages from clergy people, from teachers, from grandparents.
Authority figures. Yeah.
Yeah, I had my grandkids here this past weekend, and I was very aware, that everything I'm saying and doing is shaping their shadows.
Yeah. So what are some good questions for our listeners to ask themselves if they're in touch with their inner child? I think as a foundation before diving into exploring your shadows in the dynamic with another person, it's good to take a step back and ask yourself, like, if you're in touch with your inner child and explore a little bit how your caregivers showed love and support.
Okay. So you are probably good at these prompts, but let me offer a few, and then you can offer some. So for example, do you recall the messages you received as a child from parents and teachers and clergy persons and grandparents, aunts and uncles, any adults in your world? What messages did you receive about what's good behavior and what's bad behavior? What are positive feelings and what are negative feelings? What's okay and what's not okay? And what are the consequences for you of receiving those messages when you were a child? Were you punished? Were you criticized? Were you shamed? Were you physically abused?
Mhm.
And So if you look at the messaging, the source of the message, the form of the message, the consequences of the message, and then look at who you are today and what are the consequences of that particular shadow formation through the years. So let's just say it's anger. So what was the messaging about anger and how has that shaped you, whatever age you are now? What's your relationship to anger and the expression of anger? Is it always bad? Is it always hurtful? Is there any such thing as authentic anger, valid anger? And is the child in you still afraid to express that?
Mm.
So what would be an example for you that could provide some prompts?
Um, I wouldn't go into anger as much, maybe as abandonment.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if that's even the right pathway here. I guess openness and fear of vulnerability. I grew up in a household that was very rigid and strict in the good way, in a protective way, but that also cuts off opportunity to share openly and vulnerably. And I think that has affected my personal dynamics later in life.
So if you were to do some prompts for people who share that fear of being vulnerable, because I think that's really common, what would be some prompts about exploring your early vulnerability, messages about it, and how it shaped you?
I would probably ask myself to go back and think of a specific time where I felt unseen or unheard, or where I felt like I was repressing any like inner truths that I was afraid to show and talk about. So I'll try to like pinpoint at maybe a specific moment in time and explore my inner child in that sense.
Okay, that's really beautiful. I think so many people are afraid of being vulnerable. And there's a huge consequence for our adult relationships with that shadow, right? If our vulnerability wasn't honored and validated and supported, then we're going to carry that fear of that feeling through our lives. I think for me, it would be about dependency. I was just supposed to be independent from the time I was little, and that was the message.
Mm.
Don't rely on anybody else, right? That dependency shadow really shaped my dating life and my married life. And it took me a long time with my husband to really let myself rely on him,
Mm.
to really trust that he'd show up.
Yeah. It's crazy how our biggest challenges in childhood can become our biggest like compass points in life about how we go about in life. Because my fear of vulnerability, I mean, my whole work is about learning how to open up and express and be vulnerable and that's why it fuels and feeds me so much and heals that aspect of myself. So it can be a huge signpost that directs you towards understanding more about your purpose in life and your values. And it can be a beautiful guide.
That's exactly right, Keila.
Um,
Well said. Yeah.
um, have you seen any shadow projection manifesting in romantic relationships? Any scenarios? And can you explore why it's so damaging if it's left unchecked?
Sure. So, projection is natural. We can't get rid of it. Everybody's projecting all the time. It's the way that the psyche works. It's attempting to rid itself of something that's intolerable to the person. And so it's going to put it out somewhere else. We can see this in our political world now. the whole sort of tribal nature of politics, everybody's projecting, and it's been weaponized now, right? So if we look at our own lives through that lens, and we begin to see that we imagine who people are without really knowing, we kind of fantasize about who they are, um, for our own needs, right? So part of projection is about the shadow trying to find its incomplete parts. So let's say, I mentioned before, it could be looking for a parent or someone opposite the parent, right? So like when I was dating my husband, I was looking for someone opposite my father because I didn't feel safe with my father. And I thought Neil was just as opposite from my dad as he could be. But what I discovered was when Neil got angry, he was a lot like my dad, the way he expressed himself. And so my shadow led me to someone who would force me to face my issues with my dad. It would force me to become aware that I had been projecting and that I needed to reclaim that projection and really see who Neil is. And then learn with him how to communicate in a way that wasn't painful for both of us. Like you said earlier, in a way that didn't blame, because that's what my dad did. So we might, there are some projections about the parent. Other projection is kind of, we kind of swim in this myth of romance in our culture, the movies and the novels. And so there's this kind of collective mythology that romance is going to save us. So we could project a savior. And it's a lot of it's unconscious. It could be this man has enough money and I'll never be poor, right? It could be this woman is so attractive that everyone will think that I'm better than I am. It could be about safety. Like, for example, one of the things I find couples struggle with is finding a safe territory of intimacy and separateness, right? How to be really close and how to also have your own life and feel your own boundaries. And that territory is different for every couple. And it's a struggle over the years because that changes, because our needs change. So people project that guy is too distant, or she's too needy, or she's chasing me, I feel suffocated, or he's distancing, I feel abandoned. And so that territory around where you feel safe with closeness and separateness is rich with projections in most relationships.
Yeah. I have two thoughts before I lose them. So I want to take a step back and clarify projection for everyone because it can be a little bit slippery for people to grasp. And it is one of the most common shadow-driven habits, I believe. Um, so just for example, whenever you feel insecure about your own abilities or you start accusing and pointing out flaws to someone else, I think that can be a clear sign of projection. Um, if you're accusing someone of being overly critical or dismissive, projection is like holding up a mirror and seeing the other person's face instead of seeing ourselves. So in doing the shadow work, we clear the fog, the smog, and start to see where we are at the root of what we're seeing. So that was one thought. If you want to add any notes or points to.
Yeah, so often we're seeing a part of ourselves in the mirror, right? However, that isn't true in situations of abuse.
Right, that was my next thought. Like, when do you discern if it's a projection or if there is something more serious at play and it's, your gut or your intuition telling you to take a step back.
Yeah, it's really important. Great question. So let's say a woman is feeling emotionally controlled. She's feeling, she would call it abuse, but he's just saying he's asking for what he wants. And she starts to feel smaller, quieter, scared, and he's getting louder. Because whatever it is he wants, it could be more nurturing, it could be more sex, it could be more attention, it could be more respect. Whatever it is he's demanding, if she's feeling like she's giving that and she's being told she's not, then they're sort of in two different realities.
Mhm.
And so there's a sign when you're kind of in two different realities, that's a sign of projection, right? You're not living in the same psychic space. But if she starts to feel in this kind of situation that she's not heard, not seen, losing her voice, losing her power, losing her autonomy, then it's starting to verge on emotional abuse,
Mm.
right? And from my point of view, it's time for therapy. Now, if he gets physically abusive, if he starts losing control of his anger, then it starts to get dangerous. She needs to protect herself. Okay, then she's not projecting because he's acting out his shadow. So if he's acting it out, she's not projecting. There's this thing in psychology called projective identification, which involves two people projecting on each other at the same time and taking in, identifying with the projection. So this can get really complex, Keila. This can get really tricky. But there's this boundary that has to be drawn when there's abuse. It's not enough for him to say, you're projecting on me if he's being abusive. That's not an excuse for abuse. And in that situation, it's sort of gender stereotyping what I'm doing, but in that situation, she needs to take care of herself and protect herself.
Mhm.
And I think for all of us, when we start to feel silent, when we're not sharing our vulnerability, like you said, our intimacy, when we start to feel like we're withdrawing our energy from the relationship or we're disappearing in the relationship, all of those feelings are important signs, that it's time to get help, therapy, shadow work, guidance of some kind,
Mhm. Yeah,
and not just call it projection,
yeah,
because it can be an excuse.
right. Yeah, there's a time and place where it's okay to bring awareness and understanding at the shadows coming up at play, but there's also kind of a threshold that if you're surpassing that threshold in the relationship dynamic, then you need outside support, or
Right,
it's not enough just to bring in that awareness and function within
right.
the awareness. I love to move now to the topic of triggers and just the importance of noting these triggers when they arise and learning how to dance with ourselves, with our partners through triggers and knowing how to respond and not react to triggers.
So I'm trying to remember what you said about triggers in the shadow work journal. What did you say there?
Triggers, I mean, they're like signposts guiding us to our shadows, and they come up in the most unexpected and unpredictable ways. And they can take hold and control of ourselves whenever they happen. So that's why it's really important to find a grounding practice or a centering practice, which you mention a lot in your work as well, through meditation or deep breathing or other centering, grounding practices so that you can stop the momentum of a trigger before it takes hold and takes control in the moment. Because at that point, we're acting out our shadows and not acting from an authentic whole place.
Right. And because so much of this happens unconsciously, it's really tricky. So we have to learn to be aware. It's almost like we have to be vigilant. Once we start getting to know our shadow characters, we have to be vigilant with our awareness so that it doesn't find its way in and start to control us. So let's say, for example, I mean, what I found in my practice with couples is one of the most common triggers is when people feel unseen and unheard and invisible, disrespected, unimportant, that kind of clump of feelings. In psychology, we call it narcissistic injury. And that group of feelings really is painful for people. And a lot of people react with anger when that's triggered, a lot of anger. And other people react by withdrawing and getting sad. But those same feelings are underneath those behaviors, right? So if you know that that's your trigger, you can identify it as a shadow character, give it a name, whatever, invisible one or unimportant person, or, you know, you can make up a name so that you, as soon as the trigger starts to happen, you can go, oh, that's, and identify the shadow figure, take a breath, right? And come to your centering practice and recognize, okay, how am I going to respond differently now? Because now I know this is mine. This is not the other person or what he or she is doing. This is mine. This is my shadow, right? And I can say, if you have a good intimacy, you can say, my shadow's triggered and I'm feeling unimportant. I need to take a break. And you can go for a walk. Or if you're not that overwhelmed, you can say, my shadow's triggered and I'm feeling disrespected. Can we talk about it? Could we talk about it now, or can we talk about it in an hour after I meditate? Let's talk about why this is going on and how we could communicate differently. And what starts to happen is that trigger will show up less and less as that process is honored, included in the relationship. Oh, you're triggered when you feel disrespected. I really want to know when that's happening so I'm not causing you that pain. I
Yeah.
mean, imagine if your partner said that to you, how incredible it would be. What a gift it would be, right? I respect you so much, but I'm doing something that makes you feel disrespected. So let's figure that out.
Yeah.
And you can say the disrespect didn't start with you, right? This trigger started in my childhood. It didn't start with you, and I'm not blaming you for it. That's really important. I'm not blaming you for it. But there's something you're doing right now that's triggering me in that way.
It's a very empowering way to go about conflict. And conflicts kind of edges us to go about it in disempowering ways, taking away the potential potency for healing and love in relationships. But at the same time, approaching it in this way uplifts and empowers. So I can see how that can create such an honorable space for people to act out, not in their anger and their triggers, but to act out from a place of love, which is the foundation of the relationship in the first place.
Relationship becomes this vehicle for your development, right? It becomes a vehicle for your healing because you can begin to heal your narcissistic injury if you say to your partner, I really need to be seen and validated. And I know you already feel that way, but I need the words. And I'm not blaming you because I know you didn't cause this, but I need the words. I need these words. I need these reactions. I need these behaviors. And slowly, slowly, you build that into your relationship and it becomes a healing journey. And
Yeah.
it can lead to what I call the shadow marriage,
Mhm.
right? The shadow marriage, which we wrote about in Romancing the Shadow, is the full potential of a relationship to welcome the multitudes of who we are, or the committee members, or whatever we call it, all of the shadow parts that are difficult and challenging, and so we kind of vow to honor and respect those parts of ourselves and of our partner.
Can you
And
share?
that's like a whole other thing. Yeah.
I have two thoughts again. Hold on.
Yeah.
Well, can you start by sharing a little bit more about your shadow marriage that you've cultivated over time with Neil?
Well, Neil and I were married 28 years ago, and we both have done spiritual practice in many traditions. And so we created a ceremony in 5 different spiritual traditions. And one of them was shadow work. And so we, at that point, knew each other's shadow characters to some degree. Some more of them showed up in the marriage, right? But we knew a lot of them from being together for 4 years. And we decided, so for one example, I was kind of the distancer and he was kind of the pursuer.
Mhm.
So as an example, we made a vow to honor and respect and include those shadow characters in our relationship. So he would honor the distancer in me. Why did I need the distance? What was I afraid of? And what was valid in that need? And I was honoring in him the pursuer. Why did he need so much closeness? And what was I afraid of in that? Right? And what was valid in his need? And those had started out as triggers for each other. So they went from triggers to shadow characters to really being included as part of ourselves in the marriage.
That's
And
beautiful.
yeah, it's beautiful. And now we have this perspective of how much those shadow characters have changed over the years. I mean, there was a period where they kind of reversed,
Huh.
where he needed more space and I kind of pursued him. And there's a whole dance, right, over the years. And now it's just kind of very balanced. We don't have that tension between those two anymore because we're just so close. But the shadow marriage is a way to imagine, I think. I also talk about the third body, which
Mhm.
is a kind of field, an intersubjective field that gets created in this kind of marriage that holds us, something larger that holds the two. And it gives people a vision of what's possible.
That's
Yeah, it's beautiful.
kind of answered my second question, but we can dive deeper, I feel. What do you do when you're both triggered and you express your needs and the needs clash? So your example was perfect. You were the independent and needed that dependency, and he was the pursuer and needed that kind of,
He needed more independence.
yeah, he needed.
Yeah. He needed to cultivate his independence, and I needed to cultivate my dependence.
Right.
Yes,
What
that's
do you
right.
do when the needs clash?
Well, for some people, they only appear to clash. So
Mm.
I would say for me and Neil, they only appeared to clash because they were triggers. right? Because they had so much unconscious charge in them. It seemed impossible that we'd ever find that territory where we both felt safe. And we had to work at it. For other people, they really do clash. So let's say there's addiction involved. In that case, the needs really could clash. Somebody, like I had a couple, he wanted to drink every single night and she couldn't stand it. There was, we explored deeply what was going on in both of them, but they really had different clashing needs. For other people, the needs might be temporary.
Mhm.
So, for example, somebody wants to go out at night and seek out stimulation, and somebody's more introverted and really wants to stay home and be quiet and have. So you kind of look at some people will work with that around compromise, some will work with that around um, what are the deeper needs? So, what are the deeper needs for the stimulation? And how can your partner participate in that? And the other way, how can your partner participate in the quiet time? What if you meditated together? Would that give her the quiet time or him? Um, what if you had dinner with a few other people? Would that give the stimulation to that partner? So there are ways to work out these things out behaviorally. But in terms of the shadow work, you want to excavate deeper
Right.
to see if one of these is a shadow character,
Mhm.
right? Does the person who wants to stay home have a shadow character that's hiding from something, that's afraid of something? I mean, this happened a lot with COVID.
Mhm.
People got stuck at home, right? And then the need for stimulation just exploded afterwards. So going deeper, you might discover parts, shadow parts, that really have different needs that you weren't even aware of when you got together.
And
And
just
maybe they're not compatible.
yeah. And just a note on resources to go deeper and identify these shadow parts and characters. I just want to share here that the Zenfulnote app is available as a resource if anyone needs that additional support or tool to guide them through that expedition of the inner self in real life scenarios and situations. I'll include a link with this interview on Substack for a free year, and anyone can download on iOS or Android. But we've developed a check-in method that integrates the shadow character identification. And I hope that's going to be really helpful for you guys.
Yeah, it will be.
Um, and then I do want to transition because we only have a few minutes left, but I think it'll be perfect to close this conversation out talking about communication in relationships because that is the lifeblood of all relationships. And also developing shadow language, having the right verbal words to express yourself in a way that's not blaming or shaming.
Yeah, so important. So Neil and I had a real breakthrough when we promised each other that we'd stop saying you. And, you is related to projection,
Mhm.
but it also creates blame. And it accuses someone, and then they get defensive. And then what happens? They get triggered, and their shadow comes up, right? So it escalates. So when we stop saying, you did this, or you don't do that, or, you won't, or, everything changed for us. And we began more and more to take accountability for our own experience. Whatever I'm experiencing is mine. It's not really about him, unless there's abuse. Remember that caveat. But it's not really about him, right? It's mine. It's shaped by my whole history and my psyche, my body, mind. And so I can't hold him accountable for it. And when he really got that at a deep level and was able to own his own experience, I remember feeling myself relax. I'd never relaxed so deeply in a relationship. I was safe because he was responsible or accountable for his own reality. And he stopped holding me accountable for it. So that kind of cliche about using I statements is really profound. And it can shift the tone and the tenor of the intimacy into more responsibility and more safety.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You want to add something about communication? Oh, you wanted to talk about how to communicate your shadow. So let's say you begin to do shadow work. You read the shadow work journal, you read Romancing the Shadow, you begin to learn the method, and you recognize, oh, my shadow's up, right? Let's call it the critic. Oh my God, I'm criticizing her again. Oh my God, that was so mean. I can't believe I criticized her again. So you say, that was my critic. That's not who I am. I'm not my shadow. I'm so sorry that my critic erupted. Let me take some time and explore why that happened, because I really want to change that behavior. I don't want to hurt you by criticizing you.
Mhm.
And you begin to do your inner work around the critic shadow. What is it needing? Why does it come up? Why did he criticize her in that moment? And you begin to see some hidden motivations. So often the critic needs distance because that's the result of criticizing someone, right? The consequences is you hurt them and you're distant. What if you could take that distance consciously?
Mhm.
So instead of criticizing you, I'm going to be able to say to you, you know what? I'm not feeling like going out with you today. I need some time alone.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
you take that need, that valid need inside of the shadow, and you meet that need for yourself. You don't ask the other person to meet that need.
Right.
You meet that need for yourself instead of pushing her away.
Mhm.
Or what would be a different example? Like maybe you're feeling that um, maybe your partner tells you that you're being controlling and or she feels controlled or he feels controlled. And you can kind of look at yourself and say, oh, let's use the judge because this happened to me. I had some friends tell me that I was too judgmental when I was younger, before the shadow days. And I started really looking at why was I so judgmental? And I recognized that there was this shadow, the judge. And as I judged people, I felt superior. And I had some hidden need to feel that superiority with people. Why? I think I was in my 20s at the time. Why was I feeling that? It protected me against feeling inferior. That's what superiority does. I mean, when you see all these people acting with arrogance and hubris, some part of them feels inferior inside and scared, right? So when I discovered that, I discovered the consequence that it was having on my relationships with my friends. I began to really work with it and apologize to people and explore equality and what that was like. And it gave me more empathy and compassion. It kind of leveled the field for me in my 20s. It was really good work. And it came through feedback from my friends,
Which is a
right?
relationship dynamic that stems out of this conversation. I think it's
Right.
still applicable.
Relationship as a mirror.
And I
So,
also,
yeah.
just one little thought out loud on communication. It's not always just about what you say, but about how you show up. And so when we're showing up reactively from our triggers, from our shadows, that is our way of band-aiding the situation. Whereas when we do create the buffer, create that space for ourselves to sit with what's going on internally, that's where the real tending and nurturing of the shadows and healing of the wounds happens. You're not just sticking the band-aid over it and covering up and not and looking away.
Yes, I would say relationships that are just starting out looking at the shadow, it's important to do what Kayla's saying. First, start with your individual inner work, your own self-observation. And then you can move toward communicating that with your partner when you're ready and
Mhm.
exploring the deeper issues together so that your relationship becomes this vehicle to expand your awareness, to explore consciousness. But
Mhm.
doing that first step of looking within is really important. That was a good point.
Absolutely. Beautiful. I think this is a great place to close out. Thank you so much, Connie, for sharing your insights. They're so valuable, and I know that a lot of people will resonate with these topics. So
And you too, Kayla. Thank you.
appreciate it.